Hi, everyone. I'm Joanne Klein. I'm an MVP in M365 apps and security, and I work for my own consulting company, Next Novus.
And I'm David Drever. I'm also a Microsoft MVP in Microsoft 365 and security as well, and I work with Protiviti. So, Joanne, what's next on the docket today?
Well, we're talking about insider risk management and the remaining solution that it integrates with that we haven't talked about yet is something near and dear to my heart, and that is data lifecycle management. So let's talk about that and how those two features work together.
Absolutely.
Okay, so before we start, I'm just going to give you a bird's eye view of what data lifecycle management does and records management. It's the purview service that is responsible for ensuring content is being retained due to regulatory or business reasons. It reduces redundant, obsolete, and trivial content through the use of retention policies that delete content. And then it can do record preservation. So business, operational, historical records of value can be preserved with retention labels. So that's what data lifecycle management does on its own. But it also has an integration point with insider risk management. And you may be wondering, what is the touch point between these two? And if you think about, again, a risky user inside insider risk management, one of the things that they may do is exfiltrate data. So think of the employee departure scenario where somebody's leaving and they've got a bunch of content that they want to take with them. So they may start copying that content externally. And then if they're disgruntled, sometimes that happens, they'll maybe start or go back to SharePoint or OneDrive, wherever that content was, and delete it from there. Mm-hmm. So using that same user risk level that can be enabled inside insider risk management through adaptive protection, the elevated risk level can start preserving any of that content that was deleted. So this, helps to protect the business records in that kind of elevated risk scenario. So one thing I want to talk about is you may be thinking, but there's already controls in place to prevent that from being deleted. So you might say there's deletion. If an end user deletes content, it's audited, so we're going to know. Yes, it's audited, but the likelihood of you noticing that inside of the Office 365 audit log is pretty low. There's lots of activity being audited there. You probably wouldn't detect it unless you're intentionally looking for that kind of activity. Mm-hmm. Another thing is the recycle bins. Yeah. Right? So for sure, if you delete anything, it's going to go into the first stage recycle bin. If you delete it out of there, it's going to go into the second stage recycle bin. You can even delete it out of the second stage if you have the permission and the know-how to do so. So that's not fail-safe either.
And let's be honest, sometimes it's administrators that are getting disgruntled too, not just the employees. So they have that ability to get in there.
That's right. So you have to think like somebody who's disgruntled. What kind of are the sequence of activities that they might do, and how can you kind of mitigate that risk? The other thing is, what if there's a retention label on that content or a retention policy in effect? And although those help, it doesn't necessarily protect you from deletion. It kind of depends on the setting of the retention label, if it's a record or not, if it's a retention policy. It might, it will be preserved in the preservation hold library, but, it only stays there for a certain length of time, and you may not notice this until after that. So none of those on their own are 100% guarantee that it's going to preserve the content. So this is what insider risk management will do once an user is detected to have an elevated risk. So it preserves all of that deleted content in that same preservation hold library that is, automatically provisioned on a SharePoint site. It's hidden, but it's in there, and it copies, basically, a full copy of all that deleted content into the preservation hold library in a special folder called Protected, for exactly this reason. And it stays there for, last I heard, it was a hard 120 days. I don't think that's configurable. Might be one day, but so basically you have 120 days to go in there and restore the data if it was deleted.
Well, and this all comes along with an alert from IRM on top of that, right? So you're going to know
Yes.
that IRM has fired in order to do this. So your 120 days, if it's taking you 120 days to look at an IRM alert, there's something else going on in your organization you need to deal with, right?
Yeah, for
so
sure.
120 days is actually a lot of time.
Yeah, it is. And that speaks to the importance of triaging the alerts and having that process in place in your organization. It's one thing to enable, adaptive protection and all these insider risk management policies, but somebody has to be in there looking at them and taking action on them. And in this case, getting the content out of the PHL that was deleted. So I like this feature.
Yeah, and what I like about it too is that it separates it from the other components of the PHL, because sometimes when you're needing to deal with PHL data and all the different versions that are in there of a document, it gets a little bit overwhelming. But because it organizes it into its own folder, you can go in there and say, oh, here it is. It's all right here. I can bring it back out as necessary.
Yeah, that's right. I'm assuming, I haven't tried this, but I'm assuming you'd have to copy it out of there and not move it out of there, because usually you can't delete anything out of the PHL. But anyway, at least if you copied it, you still have a copy of the document.
And it's again, like everything else, it's e-discoverable. It's you'll be able to find it and things like that. So you're good to go as far as that's concerned. So
that's right. Somebody asked me a great question at a conference I was at on how can you prevent disgruntled users from deleting content when they're going. If it takes a while for them to be detected as an elevated risk level, and IRM does go back in time, a certain window that I think you can configure to look back at activity, but only until you're deemed at an elevated risk is it going to start actioning this DLM policy. But I mean, that's, I think 3 days, 3 consecutive days of certain activity levels that you can determine can get you up into that elevated risk level. So that's a pretty guaranteed way of making sure you're catching that activity that a disgruntled user has done.
And this is a question I don't know the answer to, so I'm wondering if you do. So you can configure an IRM policy to fire when a user is tagged as being terminated or has handed in the resignation through the HR connector. Would this be a trigger for the same thing? Like not just an elevated user, but could you fire off an adaptive protection for that situation where they're not tagged as elevated, but they have been tagged because they have been marked as resigning or terminated?
Are you asking if that would automatically make them elevated risk?
Or not necessarily elevated risk, but would it allow and would it simulate, maybe it would be, so if it would simulate an elevated risk so that this particular situation would fire?
I don't think it doesn't automatically make them at an elevated risk, but it does, if you have that integration, it does automatically start monitoring them. And so if they're doing risky activity, it would put them at the appropriate risk level.
Like I've built HR connectors for clients before, but I wasn't too sure about this integration with adaptive protection, if that was there with that situation or not. We never got into it, but I don't think so, because to your point, it's a trigger for an alert. It's not necessarily a trigger for elevated risk.
Right.
And it's elevated risk that triggers the adaptive protection. So it makes sense. It would be nice, and maybe that's something we can mention to Microsoft. If you have situations where the HR connectors, that's what the HR connector is there for. It's there to watch for situations like this.
It is,
And so maybe not necessarily call them a risky user, but if they are suddenly doing stuff like this, and they're already triggered because they are in a situation where they are um, being monitored through the HR connector, might not be a bad idea to have that integration with the adaptive protections.
Yeah, but I believe if you have adaptive protection enabled and those indicator thresholds configured, if an end user is, I mean, it's scanning everybody, all users for that activity, including somebody who is departing. So I'm not sure it would make it any quicker to make them an elevated risk user.
Well, yeah, but usually what happens is with that because remember that HR connector is what becomes like. So if you use just a standard data leak IRM policy or IRM template, it's going to have a number of different thresholds on there that you need to configure to fire it off. But with the departing user template, is using it. Your trigger is actually the user being added to that HR connector. And so at that point, it's already triggered if the user does one or two things under that policy.
Right.
So, but I don't believe right now that policy will allow it to elevate a person for elevated risk. And that's what I'm talking about is if I'm leaving the company and I'm already being more scrutinized because I'm being flagged as leaving the company.
Yeah.
I would actually almost put myself as a risky user in that perspective. That's my argument to it anyways.
So you don't think a departing user, if they were doing risky activity, would be picked up by adaptive protection, or am I missing what you're
No,
down?
you're not missing it at all. What I'm saying is that if you are a departing user, I think that should automatically make you a risky user and have adaptive protections in place.
Okay. Yeah, hard to say.
Like, you want to put your trust in your people, but at the same time, history has shown us that, when people are leaving, they're taking stuff with them they shouldn't be taking with them, or they're doing things they shouldn't be doing.
Right.
The system doesn't understand why a user is leaving. They just know that the user is leaving. So to me,
right.
Are you losing anything by, let's say for instance, let's say for instance that a user is elevated because they are departing. They're elevated, and you trap some content or something along that line. A quick review is going to show whether it was malicious or not, and at that point in time, you can release that data, right? So
yeah,
you don't release it. You don't have to restore it after 120 days. It'll be released on its own anyways. So I guess to me, it's a question of, are you losing anything by taking that approach?
I would say IRM alerts, I believe it's a delicate balance between too much noise and making sure that you're catching the risky activity. So I don't know, it would be interesting to see. That means every employee that was leaving is going to be at an elevated risk. There's going to be all kinds of alerts that are being thrown just through normal day-to-day activity, legitimate activity that they might be doing.
Point, yeah.
So maybe it depends on the size of the company and how, the IRM team.
And maybe even their own, so maybe make it a toggle or something like that. So if you're departing, you can choose to do elevated risk automatically or something along that line.
Right.
It depends on the company and how concerned they are about this. Maybe they've been burned before, so they want to have that.
Yeah.
And to your point, if you're dealing with a company that's 30, 40,000 users, they're going to have hundreds of users leaving in a week.
Right.
It can get very noisy. You get a great point there. So it's great. It's all about the balance, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I see I got the risk levels wrong because I didn't review this before. I can't remember if it was this session or the last one. Minor, moderate, and elevated are the 3 risk levels for a user. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Well,
all right.
This was great. So I think that finishes off the IRM series.
It does, and it also brings us to our completion of our 10th episode, Joanne.
Yeah, that's great. That came quick.
It did. It's been fun. So, I think we've got a lot of great content coming up here and continuing 2025.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.